Okay, Tom, welcome back. We were talking about wills versus trusts, and how people decide what they actually need in Florida. Let's talk a little bit about probate because it's been mentioned a couple of times in our last episode, and we've had a whole episode about probate. Briefly, just bring people back up to speed. What is probate, and how does having only a will maybe impact that process?
So probate is the court process. So anytime you have courts, you can have an attorney involved to represent the personal representative. Otherwise, other states use the term executor of the estate to gather the assets of the decedent that are in the decedent's name, pay last debts, creditors, and taxes, and distribute assets to the beneficiaries, all through the public court process and court oversight.
Okay. Now, how then does having a trust potentially change the picture involving probate for a Florida family?
So probate, again, is the process of taking assets that are in the decedent's name. So when you have a trust, and if it's properly funded and properly done right, when a person dies, the assets aren't in the decedent's name. They're in a trust name. And as such, there's no assets subject to probate because there's no assets in the decedent's name. They're in a trust name. And that leaves it subject to a trust administration, which is outside of the court control.
Okay. And for people concerned about privacy, it sounds like that's a potential factor and how a trust can help. But what's the difference between wills and trusts and how they handle privacy of the estate?
Sure. Probate the public process. So anybody can go online and look at your will and see who you left your assets to and who you disinherited. And, they can look at the different things going on in your estate. And if you're a private person or if you're a celebrity and things like that, you don't want people to know much about your business, then the nice thing is a trust is a private document that does not record it, that is not subject to public viewing records. And as such, it allows you to maintain your private process. And only the beneficiaries and the trustee get access to that document.
Okay. That's helpful to know. Now, let's talk about the cost a little bit and the maintenance of what these documents need if you create them for the first time when you're in your 40s, but you're going to live another 40 years potentially. um and some of the practicalities, a lot of people worry that trusts are too expensive. How do you help clients think about the cost of a will versus the cost and long-term benefits of a trust?
Well, I think the first thing you have to look at is you go through probate, the statutes say a reasonable rate for the attorney and the personal representative is 3% each. So let's say you have $1 million estate, that's a $60,000 administration fee between the attorneys and the personal representative. So that's the first thing that you're going against. If you don't properly plan and you end up in probate, that's a pretty hefty fee. So one of the things I can tell people is if you do a trust, you're avoiding those court costs and attorney's fees to a large extent. Now, I think there's some misnomer that there's no fees, but at the end of the day, it's either, I guess, pay me a little bit more now versus a will, or pay me a lot later on the other side with a probate. So um, there is additional fees. I mean, trusts are a more complex document. It's more time consuming. You have to fund the trust properly. And I always say a trust is like carpet too. I mean, at the end of the day, 15 years ago, my office had all brown carpet in here and tans and greens, and that was the color frame. And then a couple of years ago, my wife told me blues and greens are more appropriate. So we had to update our office. So it's the same with the trust. Laws change, your beneficiaries change, your trustees may change. Maybe when your child's 15, you don't have him act as a trustee, but when he's 35, you're comfortable with him. So, unfortunately, our lives constantly change and we have to keep advice. And that's whether you do a will or a trust, you always have to stay on top of that.
Yeah. And you just mentioned some of the ongoing maintenance that a trust
Mm.
requires, that a will doesn't.
A will
Uh,
does now. A will does require those.
okay.
Because at the end of the day, you still have to change your personal representative. You still have to change your beneficiaries. So that was either way, it's going to have to be done.
Okay.
It's just the complexity of the document
Gotcha.
more typically with a trust.
So what other ongoing maintenance is there with a trust, like funding or updating assets and
Yeah.
beneficiaries? Like name a few other things that you might hit occasionally.
Yeah. Other than updating the document because of a change in circumstances, you always have to keep in mind that the laws do change sometimes. So I think it's a good idea to make sure that you stay abreast if there's any law changes and have a relationship with your attorney to let you know whether there's been any statutory changes in the laws. Uh, Again, you also want to be kept apprised of any personal circumstances that change, whether your children become disabled, whether your children have a foreclosure judgment against them, whether they have creditor issues. I always compare it to like when I was a little kid, they had a little light bulb, Tom and Jerry being changed around, and Jerry didn't run around the corner, and the little light bulb went off, and he said, "I got to stop." And that's the same thing. You know, we get to think about your trust all the time and your wills all the time to say, okay, are there changes in my personal circumstances that require me to change my documents?
Okay.
Well, and there's really no time frame in that. That's just personal.
Okay. Now, and this is something that's always confused me a little bit because we have a supplemental needs trust for my daughter.
Mhm.
Can you explain exactly what funding a trust actually means? Because I know it can be different for different people. And what
Sure.
happens if someone creates a trust but never actually funds it?
And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes I see from other offices when I have people come in and see me and say, "Oh, I did a trust on my own, or I did a trust with Attorney Jones, and
Mm,
I'm done." Well, the big thing with a trust is what you just referred to as funding. And really, there's two ways generally to fund a trust. One is you actively transfer the asset title from Tom Moss to the Tom Moss Trust. So you go to the bank and you change ownership from an individual account to the trust account. On your real estate, you do a deed and it's recorded with the county and it changes it from Tom Moss to the Tom Moss Trust. So you actively have to fund it by taking it and transferring the asset into the trust name. The other way to fund a trust, generally speaking, is by beneficiary designation. So I can have a life insurance policy that I own, but the beneficiary of the life insurance on my death is the trust. So the trust is funded on death by the assets that pay into that trust. But what's very important is either you fund it during your lifetime or you fund it on your death. Because if you don't, then you did a trust and you're still going to end up with a probate. And you don't want that to happen.
okay. Now, here in Florida, we've mentioned this a few times before. We have a lot of people that move into Florida. They didn't maybe write their first will or have it created their first created their trust here in Florida. If they have something old or that's been around for a while from another state, what do they should they know about updating it now that they live in Florida?
Yeah. So I think the first thing, anytime you move to Florida, we have homestead laws here in Florida that are very different than almost any state. And most trusts from other states don't comply. And you could lose your ad valorem tax benefits if you put your house into the trust. So we moved from Michigan, and the Michigan attorney said, always put your house in trust, always put your house in trust. If you have that trust from Michigan and you move to Florida and you title in the name of the trust, you probably won't get your ad valorem tax benefits. One, you need to have that review from a homestead language. Two, there's restrictions on devise of homestead. Florida limits who you can leave your homestead to if you're married or if you have minor children.
Hmm.
So even if I own a home and I live in it and it's only in my name, my wife never contributed $1 to it. Never, if title's not in her name, when I die, if I have a wife, my wife is protected in that interest. So you have to always, and if I have minor children, it restricts what you can do. So you always have to be careful with what you do with your house if you have a spouse or minor children.
Hmm.
So that's a consideration. And the last thing is just general conflicts of laws. Some states allow for certain things, some states do not. Michigan has their own rules, Florida has their own rules. Virginia has their own rules, North Carolina has their own rules. And what you have to be careful is when you move to another state to make sure that now that you're a Florida resident, that your out of state documents don't conflict with Florida law, because that can create more litigation and more issues. Well, I think what people need to understand is the best way to preserve family harmony and to ensure that what you want done is to spend a little time thinking about it ahead of time. And You know your children better than anybody. You know your beneficiaries better than anybody. You know the people that you're acting as a fiduciary better than anybody. And if there's problems now, you really need to think about making sure we address them, because when you're gone, you can't address them any longer. And the last thing you want is a family that fights, or beneficiaries that fight, or your assets to go to someone or somewhere that you didn't want them to go. So I think just remember how important it is. It's not something that should be looked at lightly. It's not something I think that you shouldn't go without professional advice on. Um, and just be careful, because what you don't know can hurt yourself.